I have spent a long life observing how people think, decide, and allocate their resources. Over decades, I have noticed a recurring pattern. The difficulties people encounter are rarely the result of bad luck or extraordinary complexity. They arise instead from simple, predictable mistakes, errors that could have been avoided if a little patience, discipline, and reflection had been applied. Time and again, people misunderstand the forces that govern human behavior, particularly when it comes to money, personal security, and the subtle mechanics of decision-making. They assume that sharing information freely is virtuous, that cleverness can substitute for caution, or that the intentions of others will reliably align with their own. These assumptions are convenient, but they are misleading, and they are costly. The problem is that the mind itself can be a dangerous tool when left unchecked. Human psychology is full of predictable biases: envy, overconfidence, impatience, and a constant underestimation of compounding effects over time. Most difficulties in life are compounded not by sudden shocks, but by a series of small, avoidable errors. People repeatedly give away leverage, optionality, and control without recognizing the long-term consequences. The lessons I offer today are not theoretical or exciting. They are the distilled observations of someone who has watched these patterns unfold, both in the successes and failures of others, over many decades. They are quiet warnings about the predictable ways life punishes lapses in judgment, disclosure, and foresight. It is within this context that I begin with a principle that underpins everything else I have learned. Avoiding stupidity matters more than demonstrating cleverness. Avoiding stupidity matters more than demonstrating cleverness. If there is one lesson I wish more people understood earlier in life, it is that success is rarely the result of extraordinary brilliance. It is far more often the result of consistently avoiding obvious mistakes. I have known many people who were smarter than I am who ended up with worse outcomes. And the reason was not bad luck. It was unforced error. Human beings are naturally drawn to displays of intelligence. We like clever arguments, bold predictions, and novel ideas. Unfortunately, life does not reward cleverness in isolation. It rewards survival, durability, and the ability to keep playing the game. You do not need to be the fastest thinker in the room if you can simply avoid stepping into traps that are visible to anyone who is paying attention. In my experience, the biggest failures come from ignoring basic realities. People borrow too much because interest rates are low and optimism is high. They concentrate their investments because confidence feels good. They enter partnerships without clear incentives because trust feels virtuous. None of these errors require low intelligence. In fact, very intelligent people are often more vulnerable because they can rationalize poor decisions with elaborate reasoning. The proper approach is inversion. Instead of asking, "How do I become extremely successful?" ask, "How do people reliably ruin their lives?" The answers are remarkably consistent: excessive leverage, untreated ego, impatience, envy, and the inability to admit error. Avoid those, and you are already ahead of most of the population. I have spent decades watching compounding work in both directions. Small advantages, sensibly protected, grow quietly over time. Small errors, repeated or left uncorrected, eventually become catastrophic. The difference between the two is not genius. It is discipline. Cleverness often pushes people toward activity. Wisdom often pulls them toward restraint. The investor who does nothing when nothing intelligent can be done usually outperforms the one who must constantly prove how smart he is. The same principle applies outside of investing. The quiet avoidance of folly produces a life that looks almost boring from the outside but functions extraordinarily well from within. If you remember nothing else, remember this: the world is not fair, but it is fairly predictable in how it punishes foolish behavior. Stay in the game long enough, avoid the obvious errors, and time will do most of the heavy lifting for you. Information is leverage once given away. It cannot be reclaimed. One of the most misunderstood ideas in modern life is the belief that openness is always virtuous. People confuse honesty with indiscretion. They assume that sharing information builds trust, when in reality it often transfers leverage in ways they do not understand. Information changes incentives the moment it leaves your control. Once someone knows your financial position, your intentions, or your vulnerabilities, they may begin to behave differently toward you, not necessarily out of malice, but because human behavior adjusts automatically to new inputs. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation. I have seen countless people harm themselves by revealing too much too early. An employee announces plans to leave and suddenly finds opportunities drying up. A person shares financial success and becomes a target for comparison, expectation, or resentment. Another reveals uncertainty or weakness to the wrong audience and quietly loses credibility. None of these outcomes were intended, but all were predictable. The mistake is assuming that people will process information the way you would. They will not. They will process it through their own incentives, fears, and self-interest. That is why professionals exist. Lawyers, accountants, and advisors are bound by structure and obligation to handle sensitive information responsibly. Casual acquaintances are not. Inversion is again useful. Before you share something personal or strategic, ask a simple question. What advantage does the listener gain from knowing this? If the answer is unclear, the risk is probably higher than the reward. This does not mean living a secretive or dishonest life. It means being deliberate. A well-run operation does not broadcast internal details to the public. It releases information only when doing so serves a purpose. Individuals should think the same way. Once information is released, it cannot be retrieved. You cannot control how it is repeated, interpreted, or used. That loss of control is permanent. Intelligent people respect irreversible decisions, whether in capital allocation or in communication. A long, stable life is built by maintaining leverage, optionality, and flexibility. Careless disclosure erodes all three. Guard your information the way you guard your time and capital. All of them are finite, and none should be squandered casually. Incentives, not intentions, govern how people use what you tell them. One of the most reliable lessons I have learned is that you can predict human behavior far better by studying incentives than by listening to stated intentions. People are not as complicated as they imagine themselves to be. Change the incentive structure, and behavior changes, often immediately, and often without conscious thought. Most disappointment in life comes from assuming others will act out of kindness, loyalty, or fairness when the incentives point elsewhere. This is not because people are evil. It is because incentives quietly overpower good intentions over time. Anyone who ignores this reality is volunteering to be surprised in unpleasant ways. I have seen this repeatedly in business, family arrangements, and friendships. A person shares financial details with a relative, expecting discretion and goodwill. Later, that same relative behaves differently when money is discussed, not out of cruelty, but because the knowledge has altered expectations. The incentive has shifted. The relationship follows. The same thing happens in organizations. Tell colleagues you are planning to leave, and their incentive to invest in you declines. Reveal uncertainty to someone who controls opportunities, and they may respond by limiting risk, meaning you. They may even believe they are acting responsibly. Incentives work whether or not anyone admits them. This is why professionals matter. A lawyer's incentive is shaped by legal duty. An accountant's incentive is constrained by professional standards. These structures exist precisely because human nature cannot be trusted to behave well in the absence of aligned incentives. When people bypass structure in favor of personal trust, they are often substituting hope for design. Inverting the problem clarifies it. Ask not whether someone is well-intentioned. Ask what happens if circumstances change. Ask what they gain, lose, or risk depending on how they use the information you provide. If the answer makes you uneasy, wisdom suggests restraint. Long-term success is built by designing environments where good behavior is the natural outcome, not a heroic exception. That applies to companies, governments, and personal relationships alike. When incentives align, trust is reinforced. When they do not, trust becomes a liability. I have rarely seen people fail because they misunderstood incentives intellectually. I have often seen them fail because they chose to ignore them emotionally. The discipline to respect incentives, even when it feels impolite or overly cautious, is a mark of maturity. Privacy preserves optionality, and long-term advantage optionality is one of the most underappreciated assets in life. It gives you the ability to wait, to choose, and to respond rather than react. Once lost, it is very difficult to regain. Privacy is one of the primary tools for preserving it. When you reveal too much about your plans, finances, or intentions, you narrow your future choices. Other people begin to act on the assumption that your path is fixed. They adjust their behavior accordingly. Doors close quietly, often without explanation, and you are left wondering what changed. I have seen this in business repeatedly. The person who keeps plans private until execution retains control. The one who talks too early invites interference, resistance, or premature judgment. This is not because others are hostile, but because uncertainty makes people defensive. Your privacy reduces their incentive to act against you. There is also a psychological benefit. When you do not publicly declare your intentions, you are free to change your mind. You can revise plans based on new information without embarrassment or pressure to remain consistent. Flexibility is a form of intelligence, and privacy protects it. Modern culture encourages constant disclosure. People are rewarded socially for announcing goals, opinions, and personal details. Unfortunately, life does not reward visibility in the same way. It rewards results, durability, and good timing. Privacy supports all three in investing. The best decisions often involve waiting while doing nothing. The same is true in life. If you preserve optionality, time becomes an ally. If you give it away, time becomes a constraint. Inversion again provides clarity. Ask yourself how people lose options. They commit publicly before they are ready. They bind themselves emotionally to plans that should remain provisional. They allow others to define their timeline. All of this happens faster when privacy is abandoned. Privacy is not secrecy for its own sake. It is strategic restraint. It allows you to observe, to learn, and to act when conditions are favorable. In a world that overvalues expression, the quiet preservation of options is a decisive advantage. Those who understand this tend to look unremarkable in the short term and extraordinarily effective in the long term. Money disclosure invites comparison, and comparison reliably breeds dysfunction. One of the most reliable ways to introduce unnecessary trouble into your life is to invite comparison, particularly around money. I have watched this dynamic play out for decades, across families, businesses, and friendships, and it almost never ends well. Money is not just a medium of exchange, it is a status signal. Once you disclose what you earn, what you own, or what you lack, you give others an invitation, often an unconscious one, to measure themselves against you. This measurement rarely produces admiration. More often, it produces envy, resentment, embarrassment, or misplaced expectation. Envy is a peculiar emotion. It does not require injustice to exist. It merely requires contrast. Two people can be doing well, and yet the one doing slightly less well feels diminished. That feeling does not improve relationships, cooperation, or judgment. It corrodes them quietly. I have seen families fracture after casual financial disclosures. One sibling becomes the successful one, another becomes the struggling one, and from that point forward, every interaction is distorted. Advice becomes condescension. Requests become obligations. Silence becomes suspicion. None of this was intended, but all of it was predictable. In business, the same principle applies. When compensation details circulate unnecessarily, focus shifts from work to grievance. People stop asking how to create value and start asking why someone else has more. Productivity declines, morale erodes, and rational behavior gives way to emotion. Inversion makes the lesson obvious. Ask yourself how people reliably damage otherwise functional relationships. One common method is introducing status competition where none is required. Money disclosure is one of the fastest ways to do that. There is no prize for transparency when it produces dysfunction. Prudence is not dishonesty. It is an acknowledgement of human nature. You are not obliged to provide information that creates misaligned incentives or emotional friction. Long-term success, both financial and personal, depends on preserving stable relationships and clear thinking. Comparison undermines both. The fewer unnecessary comparisons you invite, the smoother your path tends to be. I have never seen someone's life improve because others knew precisely how much money they had. I have seen many lives complicated by it. That asymmetry alone should guide your behavior. Premature honesty about future plans destroys leverage and timing control. There is a well-meaning idea that honesty requires early disclosure of one's intentions. In practice, this belief often produces outcomes that are both unnecessary and harmful. Timing matters, and revealing future plans before they are actionable is a common way people surrender leverage without realizing it. Leverage is simply the ability to influence outcomes in your favor. It exists in negotiations, careers, and personal decisions. Once others know your intended direction, they adjust their behavior accordingly. Rarely does that adjustment improve your position. I have seen employees announce plans to leave months in advance, believing they are being considerate. What usually follows is subtle but damaging. Opportunities diminish. Responsibilities change, trust erodes, not because the employer is vindictive, but because incentives have shifted. The person is no longer viewed as a long-term investment. The same pattern appears in business deals. When one party reveals urgency or future dependence too early, the terms worsen. Timing control is lost. What could have been optional becomes necessary, and necessity is a weak negotiating position. This is not an argument for deception. It is an argument for sequence. You do not owe the world access to your provisional thoughts. Plans evolve. Conditions change. Wisdom allows room for adjustment. Inversion again clarifies the matter. Ask how people lose control over their own timelines. The answer is usually premature disclosure. They talk before the decision is final. They announce before the structure is secure. They seek validation when they should be preparing quietly. The disciplined approach is simple. Think privately, plan carefully, act decisively. Speak only when action is no longer dependent on permission or approval. Life rewards those who manage transitions cleanly. That requires patience and restraint, not early confession. Once a plan is complete and execution is imminent, transparency is appropriate. Before that, silence is often the wiser course. In a long life, the ability to control timing, when to move, when to wait, when to speak, proves more valuable than the desire to appear open or agreeable. Those who understand this tend to arrive where they intended, with fewer unnecessary obstacles along the way. Trust without aligned incentives is a predictable source of disaster. One of the costliest mistakes I have observed is confusing trust with alignment. People place authority, money, or decision-making power in the hands of those they like, rather than those whose incentives are properly structured. When incentives diverge, character alone is rarely enough to prevent trouble. This is not a moral failure. It is a design failure. Systems should be built so that even ordinary human behavior produces acceptable outcomes over time. Resentment spoken aloud compounds faster than it ever resolves. Resentment feels justified when held privately, but once expressed, it multiplies. Words travel, interpretations distort, and motives are questioned. I have never seen resentment shared casually and resolved cleanly. More often, it damages reputations and closes doors long after the original grievance is forgotten. Silence in such cases is not repression, but strategy. Emotional discipline preserves long-term advantage in a world where careless speech carries lasting costs. Not everyone deserves access to your vulnerabilities or your truth. A mistake I have observed repeatedly is revealing personal struggles or uncertainties to people who are neither equipped nor incentivized to handle them responsibly. Sharing too freely exposes you to judgment, altered behavior, or lost opportunities. Wisdom lies in discretion. Confide only in professionals or trusted advisors, whose duty and competence ensure your vulnerabilities are handled with care. Protecting your inner life preserves freedom and long-term options. Small security lapses compound into irreversible damage over time. Modern life runs on systems that amplify both diligence and error. A single careless disclosure, like sharing a password or sensitive access, can cascade into losses far greater than anyone anticipates. I have watched capable people destroy years of effort through minor mistakes compounded over time. Discipline, structure, and redundancy are not optional. Treat access to your digital, financial, and legal life with the same seriousness as capital itself. For mistakes here are permanent and costly. If there is a single thread connecting all of the ideas we have discussed, it is this: life is governed by the interaction of behavior, incentives, time, and the compounding effects of small decisions. Every choice you make, every piece of information you share, and every opportunity you pursue, or fail to preserve, operates within this system. Rational thinking, patience, and disciplined observation of human nature allow a person to avoid the most costly mistakes. Understanding incentives helps you anticipate how others will act once they possess knowledge about you, and discretion preserves optionality, allowing decisions to be deferred until circumstances are favorable. Time amplifies both good and bad decisions. Errors left uncorrected compound into consequences that are often irreversible, while small, consistent prudence grows quietly but powerfully. Over a long life, brilliance matters far less than avoiding obvious errors. People who focus solely on cleverness frequently underestimate the quiet, structural risks around them. Those who respect the predictable ways human nature operates, who understand the limits of trust, who preserve privacy and security, and who act with restraint accumulate advantages over decades. Advantages that are almost invisible in the short term, but decisive in the long term.